title, as you can see it in the program, does not correspond exactly, and it is all my fault actually. Even though you will notice that the content of the presentation is not that different from the initial title, but what I found really, what I was anxious about the initial title was the fact that I felt it was too, pretentious, and I was not sure that my presentation would keep its promise of especially highlighting the implications of counter-storytelling and counter-narrative with regard to the institution of literature. You will see that I will be referring to the implicit questions that relate to, what we call the institution of literature, but it's more as a question than anything else. So that's actually the main reason for which I felt more comfortable with this, slight modification. Now, you can hear me? Yes. Well, I would like to thank the organizers for, first of all, for the fact that the topic and the formulation of the topic made me go back to the question of literature in relation to culture and what we assume about culture, not only its plurality and its the existence of mainstream versus oppositional or counterculture, etc. But it made me go back to a particular critical perspective from which literary texts can be approached with regard to that problematical category of culture. I say this because usually that's not my approach. For those who are familiar with the way I've been, trying to approach the literary text, and I've often been blamed by some colleagues for the fact that I'm too much into the aesthetics and aestheticist side of literature. So this, challenging topic actually made me go back to more, cultural, even to borrow Lyotard's term, to go back even to what we assume to be the figural, right, non-verbal, even though all literature is verbal and discursive, as we'll see, but at least this is what and I'm going to share with you some of the questions, some of the insights, and also some of the recent, my recent readings with regard to recent publications that try to reconsider the question of literature in relation to the cultural constructs. I would like to start with the key phrase or term of counterculture. And my first question is, what makes legitimate this label of counterculture when attributed to a text? Actually, this is the question with which my own work on this presentation started. So, is it the thematic axis that may go against, for example, the grain of generic norms? Or the patterns and motifs, against the grain of the patterns and motifs we are used to as readers? Or what may make legitimate the term counterculture? Is it rather the complicity between subversive form and an elusive thematic center? What I mean by this initial, or what remains central to my interest in this initial question, is the importance of form, that when we read with the literary narrative, and whether it can count as counter, it can encompass what we call counter narratives. And by the way, now I notice that some critics are also using counter storytelling, right, to emphasize or to imply some kind of resistive oppositional force that seems to be at work and relevant even when we are in the realm of literariness, of the imaginative constructs of literature. My second question, what type of narrative or counter-narrative might serve or present, or represent, a counterculture? Are all forms, for instance, of what we call, to borrow Raymond Williams' category, emergent cultures, are all of them necessarily countercultures? So the categories used by Raymond Williams about, the classical categories of dominant and emergent cultures can also be part of the question. Do all emergent cultures necessarily countercultures? And are literary, again, counter-narratives expressions? Are they necessarily, or are they most likely to be expressions of countercultural forms? Actually, questions like this draw our attention to the necessity of addressing the what and the how once we attribute the quality of opposition or resistance and the gesture of counteracting to a culture or a literary form. I would like to start with examples from discourses, not literary discourses, that have been using counter-narratives, and one of the most authoritative, at least as far as I know, that has been used by a professor of political psychology, Molly Andrews, in a book, in a collection of essays that she was co-edited, entitled Counter-Narratives, but it doesn't deal with literature. It deals actually with the cultural discourse of motherhood and family, and focusing on cases, clinical cases and situations in which women would produce counter-narratives by, articulating their own personal experience, counter-narratives in the sense that their life stories, the narratives of their life stories go against the normative cultural discourse or narrative of motherhood and of family structure. She says, Molly Andrews, one of the key functions of master narratives is that they offer people a way of identifying what is assumed to be a normative experience. And in this way, such storylines serve as a blueprint for all stories. For ultimately, the power of master narratives derives from their internalization. So she insists on the point that what we can identify as counter-narrative can be described as such only in relation to what counts as a master narrative. I'm interested in the way she adapts this notion to refer to cultural constructs, like, the norms and the codes, the cultural codes related to, family, the value of the family, the institution of the family, etc. But here comes the point at which Molly Andrews, cannot remain within the typically skeptical framework of literary critics and literary writers, when she says counter-narratives exist in relation to master narratives. You can say that this probably is, valid for literary narratives as well. But she says they are not necessarily dichotomous entities, right? So we see the difference from, in perspective between the point of view of someone who comes from an area that is not literary, more scientific, and the kind of point of view that necessarily preserves, the authority and the assumption we attach to science and to the scientific discourse. So they are not necessarily dichotomous entities. We will see that with literary narratives, of course, dichotomy is, and being dichotomous is, of course, the essence or at the core of the functioning of counter-narratives. To come closer to my subject matter, the question of whether the counter-narratives of experimental fiction are expressive of or contribute to the scope of counterculture, that is, whether they contribute to cultural forms of dissent and discontent, may be approached from a perspective that the implications such counter-narratives generate with regard to the image of authorship and to the conception of literature. In order to see, and my objective here is to see or to examine whether those literary counter-narratives, as they are articulated in what we call experimental fiction, bear the promise or the premise of a counterculture. Counter-narratives are articulated against the backdrop of master narratives, as theories from outside literary criticism tell us. That is the backdrop of mainstream dominant narratives, usually to counteract their discursive constructs and their ideological substance. And ideally, this would correspond to instances in which the poetics of subversion would overlap with, even would be informed by, the politics of resistance or opposition. So this is theoretically the way I would think of this subject matter. Now, to give you an illustration of the fact that this is not really too theoretical, and this has been done actually with regard to literature, with regard to the historicizing of the reading of literature and of the functioning of literature, especially in Western culture. And I was really happy to come across this relatively recent book by John Hartley, published 2003, entitled A Short History of Culture Studies. It's a book that I would recommend to most, or to all doctoral students or to keep it here. Yeah, right, because it raises the question of the connection between literature and culture, in particular canonical literature, in very pertinent and I think quite meaningful terms. Hartley tells us that the history of English literature and criticism involves a particular moment in which the attitude towards readership, of the literary canon, was perceived as an antidote to resist and counteract the threat of mass culture. Hartley begins with that key moment that started with Matthew Arnold, and that was fully implemented with F.R. Lewis from the 1930s to the 60s, and in which an urge to reread the canon was not simply for the sake of institutionalized education, but it was also a matter of taste and a matter of resisting the emerging and the threatening and suspicious mass culture. The assumption held by Matthew Arnold took the shape of the politics of literary criticism. I'm still paraphrasing Hartley. Took the shape of a politics of literary criticism with F.R. Lewis from the 30s to the 60s, whose ideas about the English literature being, I quote, the moral center of the school curriculum, gained ground in educational institutions as, I quote, in schools the emphasis was not only on the practice of literary criticism, but also on militant opposition to the supposed deadening effect of mass culture. And Hartley tells us that even with the advent of scholars like Stuart Hall and those who meant to counteract the canon, the mainstream also, so the canon even in its cultural implications of becoming part of mainstream culture by insisting on the carnival and the folk, etc., folk culture. Hartley tells us that even with the advent of scholars like Stuart Hogg and his later reshaping or revisiting, of the shaping role of folk culture and of the transgressive carnivalesque, this did not imply any reconciliation of the two presumably opposed arenas of culture, namely genuine high culture versus mass culture. Hartley insists that the way, for example, Stuart Hall uses and defends the legitimacy of folk culture does not make it interchangeable with mass culture. So he says mass culture remains the common enemy to leftists like right-wing scholars alike. Right, mass culture related to, the late development in capitalism and the manipulative tendency of mass media, etc. Are the literary narratives that counteract now the mimetic impulse of literature instances? Are they instances of solipsistic aestheticism? That is, are they instances of pure formalism? Now I move on to the type of counter-narratives that rely on departing from realism, right? That, target, among others, the literary tradition, the long-established tradition of literary realism. Are these instances of pure formal aestheticism, or do they imply a critical and resistive attitude towards mainstream culture? And does such expression generate, does it possibly generate, or at least relate to, a potential counterculture? Here I'm asking two questions, and actually the first one has been with me ever since I was working on my doctoral dissertation, that this kind of new canon, right, that corresponds to what I refer to as experimental fiction, in which form is content, but form is not the only content. So part of the content of the text is in the formal choices made. So it's mostly anti-mimetic. And so being anti-mimetic and anti-realistic, does it make it indifferent to the discourses of culture? Or if it serves, or it expresses something about culture, is it necessarily counterculture? To put it simply, I'm referring here to what even theorists of parody like Linda Hutchon have insisted upon as the persistence of satire. Hutchon tells us that even in these metafictional, self-reflexive narratives of the postmodern age, even these still relate to the world. They still relate to culture because of, or through, or thanks to, the persistence of a satiric impulse. And that satire alone is enough to say that these kind of narratives are not pure aestheticism, l'art pour l'art. Just another glimpse, actually, very quickly, about how this question of culture has been affecting also what has so far been considered as, the area of the discourse of formalism, which is narratology. In one of the recent encyclopedias on narrative theory edited by David Herman, we are told that the debate, for example, about a post-colonial narratology, how to reconcile narratology with post-colonial literature and post-colonial vision, which is often triggered, this debate triggered by the suspicion surrounding the pre-existing notion of narrativity, the fact that some post-colonial theorists would even reject the notion or the concept of narrativity because, you know, it was born in a Western, mainstream, white culture, etc. This debate about whether it is possible, and the fact that there is a debate, it means that narratology itself is reconsidering the role of culture in the analysis, in the discussion, in the examination of narratives in general. This is likely to illustrate at least the many pitfalls that the notion of counterculture may be associated with. Approaches within literary studies which merge narratological models with concepts derived from cultural studies are possible. This is what we are told by some of the recent narratologists, as I said, but they have been located within what is called post-classic narratology. So what is interesting for me is the debate itself, that narratology itself cannot go on being that hermetic, purely formal and the technical analysis of narratives. So it has been, you know, affected by the urge to reintroduce or to retrieve the cultural facet and the cultural significance of literary constructs. So one of my last questions was about anti-mimetic, and of course I'm interested in one form of literary experimental narratives that are essentially anti-mimetic, and they are of course parodic, what we call parodic narratives, and especially the parodic literary narratives in, you know, this postmodern age in which originality is no longer taken for granted, and in which novelists from the start know that inevitably they are going to repeat someone else, that they are going to quote, even unintentionally, you know, pre-existing texts. Now, the idiosyncrasies of parody, as practiced in the age of literary exhaustion, often bring to light forms of counter-narratives, the implications of which go far beyond solipsistic play and the ironies of literary self-reflexivity. Parody also brings back to debate the issue of high and popular culture and the position of literature in relation to this great divide. The parodic narratives of experimental fiction often discredit the claim made in some theories of postmodern culture, that the postmodern age corresponds to an overlap and even to a fusion of high and low, elitist and mass cultures. Two relevant illustrations in this respect can be noted in the subversive recasting that some experimental novels offer, for example, of detective and Western fiction. My point is, to put it in simpler and more concise terms, is that particular instances from experimental fiction in which parody is substantial to the text, to the narrative, can help us illustrate or see something that goes against what the theorists tell us, theorists of postmodern culture. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the claim that with the postmodern age, the modernist divide of elitist, high and low mass culture does not hold. This is, you know, the age of fusion of the two. Instances of parodic by canonical names, by canonical novelists, offer us examples of the possibility of merging the two, but without necessarily falling, because, you know, we think of any fusion of high and low as taking, you know, taking culture and literature to the lower side or strata and to, you know, the level of mass culture, which is not at all the case. And I'm very briefly, I'm going to refer to two tendencies of parodic postmodern fiction. I can't, you know, insist a lot on this because I have already published things on them and I don't want to repeat myself. The parodies of detective and Western American, right? They give us, offer us illustrations of how the parodic experimental narrative appropriates and subverts formally some of the most popular, right, commercial fiction, the detective and the Western, but the result is often, quite often, a highly challenging, quite challenging text. So we have really to go to this text I'm going to mention to see that the result is not a simple, equation or a simple marriage of low and high. The examples I have in mind are The Lime Twig and The Beetle Leg by John Hawkes. For those who may be sent for the aggregation a few years ago, my students suffered from The Beetle Leg, which is a pseudo-Western and an extremely surreal kind of Western narrative. And, they had really to struggle hard to make sense of the text, so it's really challenging. The Lime Twig is a pseudo-detective. We have the example of Ghost Town by Robert Hoover, which is more recent than Hawkes' novels, published in 1998, and I already contributed to a volume edited by Paul Varner, in which he revisits the Western. I contributed with an essay on Ghost Town by Robert Hoover, the New York trilogy by Auster, to go back to the pseudo-detective, and more recently, Last Fall, which is Ronald Suknik's last novel, published 2004, and in which he brings together the pseudo-detective. So we are not even in the model established by Edgar Allan Poe of the metaphysical detective. With this text, we are in the pseudo-detective, but we have clearly the paradigms, we have clearly the formula, the formulaic. These popular literary forms, theories tell us that what makes them also quite popular, and also the scope of innovation in them is very reduced, is the fact that they tend to repeat the same, pre-established plotline or formula. We know the detective, and we know, at least from the cinema, what is the formula of the Western. Probably Ronald Suknik is one of the most interesting among the recent revisiting of a popular narrative form, because he brings together the pseudo-detective with 9/11, with the event of 9/11, but from outside the representational process or mechanism. All these texts do not only counteract the formulaic plot lines and motifs of the popular novelistic traditions, detective and Western, but they also demystify their ideological ethos, the ideology of progress, of colonial expansion and supremacy of WASP values for the Western, and the orthodoxy of the pre-existing rational order, the orthodoxy of the Enlightenment, which is at the core of the detective, right? The stable ideological content of the detective. So what is interesting is not simply the subversion of the forms of these novelistic traditions, but the fact that the parodic texts attack as well and demystify, if you want, the ideological, not simply background, but the ideological content of those narratives. We have just to know how to read them. We have in our reading to reach the allegorical level that I'm going to mention in a minute. Now, so the formal perversion, which makes the parodic text quite challenging at the level of readability, entails, so I'm referring to those texts again, a satiric vision of the targets and purposes which detective and Western novels were made to serve in a context of mass culture. So again, what they attack for the perverse Western, if you want, for instance, is the consumerist myth, the myth at work in consumerist American culture of an epic national history, and for the detective, it is the narrative of the Western Enlightenment with its ideals of rationality and order. So what these narratives ultimately attack, counteract, are the master ideological narratives that used, of course, to give to those popular consumed novels a certain legitimacy and a certain interest. Modern and classical theories, or theorists of parody, tell us that in parodic literature, what is brought to debate is not only the particular interpretation of the imitated and the subverted archetype, the archetype being a text or a tradition or a genre. What is at stake is often the institution of literature itself. Parody thus stages, so this is a point that all theorists of parody make, right, without telling us much about what exactly about the institutional quality of literature, what is being actually questioned. Actually, it is mostly when the game of parody targets beyond its immediate object of imitation, when it targets the narratives of mainstream or of predominant culture, that is, when the parody serves a satiric message, that the oppositional potential is actually enacted. And it reaches this level when this parodic literature, when it taps into the allegorical dimension of the subverted literary text or literary subgenre. So it reaches that allegorical, for example, for the Western, the allegorical has to do with all the ideological claims that the Western has been serving. Just to give you a very brief illustration from John Hawkes's The Beetle Leg, and by the way, it's the only novel in which Hawkes uses an American setting. So in the Western frontier town, what is found accidentally at one point, almost unearthed, was a fashion magazine, which is an anachronism, right? I mean, it's not likely. I mean, we find, what we call relics of the natives or Nespa in the traditional Western. But the fact that the characters come across a fashion magazine, accidentally in the frontier town, it's, the kind of subversion and of anachronism that draws our attention to the cultural content with which the Western has been associated as a manner of creating a national history and giving an epic quality to the whole ideology of expansion, of imperialism, if you want, that the Western, used to present as a harmless progress of civilization, in opposition to the dark forces of nature, of course, associated with the natives. The text that I would like to point to also quite briefly, that are experimental, but from an age before or pre-postmodern and the pre-even modern stage, because my assumption that we find these highly daring experimental narratives with their, implicit questioning of cultural constructs, of cultural master narratives. We find them even in the more classical age of fiction. And I have in mind two texts from the Romantic canon, Pierre, or the Ambiguities, by Herman Melville, and The Sorrows of Young Werther, by Goethe. The two narratives with substantial form of irony and self-irony in them, Pierre or the Ambiguities, portrays the figure of the artist, writer, as idealized in the romantic sensibility, right? So Pierre emerges as a potential, artist, but of course the whole narrative is full of irony at his own expense. So we see Melville at the same time reenacting, but also counteracting the romantic assumption about authorship and about creativity in the novel by creating that figure of Pierre. There are, the connotations of stone, and the association with the rigidity of stone is also quite repeatedly implied in the narrative. Together with Melville was targeting the American form of romanticism, of course, and we know that in the American context, the romantic sensibility was also assimilated to the project of the national nation, to the possibility of an American distinct from the Anglo-Saxon origins, the possibility and the legitimacy of an American nation. So the parody of the romantic and even sentimental novel in Pierre or the Ambiguities is also assimilated to a critique, a harsh criticism of the ideology of a national history and of an emerging national identity. And you can see how harshly Melville was criticized when the book was published. Not simply because they misunderstood, but they certainly did understand, his critics who attacked him, without mercy. They could see that this book is quite harmful to, the project of the nation that we are still building. The second text, The Sorrows of Young Werther, in which Goethe adapts the diary form. By developing a striking, really, subversion of the diary narrative, Goethe implies as much, a critique of the cherished assumptions of romanticism as of the cultural implications of the romantic project. Actually, even if you are not familiar, or we in our reading of the romantic canon, we did not pay much attention to the cultural, ideological, if you wish. We are invited to do so when we read such texts as Pierre or the Ambiguities, or also the Sorrows of young Werther. One of the aspects of perversion, for instance, is that the protagonist, Werther, dies before the end of the narrative, and we know that with epistolary and diary narratives, we cannot imagine, of course, the narrator disappearing, because the text that we receive is supposedly emanating from his correspondence or from his self-writing. And that explains why we have vague shadow or even ghost of an editor at the beginning of The Sorrows of Young Werther, who tells us that I gathered Werther's letters and I'm offering them to you, reader, as to learn a lesson, as a friend, he says, and also for you to learn a lesson. Of course, until the end, I keep wondering what is the lesson to be offered, especially that Werther, who starts as highly optimistic and the incarnation of unlimited romantic optimism, and we cannot predict, of course, that he will commit suicide. But then, of course, he disappears. The protagonist of the diary disappears before the closure of his narrative. So that play on a double closure, on double end in the form of The Sorrows of Young Werther implies much, and when we go to the content, of course, much about Goethe's need, who is the father of the German, right, earliest version of Romanticism, his need also to take some kind of critical distance and to put into question probably some of the questions that we are invited to reach or to detect through Werther is whether, you know, romantic optimism and positive attitude is enough to preserve the human self from the temptation of suicide, which turns out also to be one of the recurrent questions in what we call now postmodern experimental fiction. It's time. Okay. Can I take 5 more minutes? Just 5 more minutes. Okay. So, with these two texts counteract, right, are not simply the formal and aesthetic choices of romanticism, but also they invite us, without being explicit, maybe Melvin's Pierre is more explicit about the target of satire, which is the emerging national culture. But with Werther, the sorrows of young Werther, the critical or satiric message with regard to the cultural implications of romanticism is something that keeps challenging us, and actually we have to, you know, construct it. The reader has to construct his or her own, if you want, interpretive structure in this respect. Now, to go back to the authorial, very quickly, the authorial position or message, especially I'm interested in particular the message of the implied author in these kind of satiric experimental narratives, is not always accessible. So sometimes the literary counter-narrative, and I gave the example of Goethe, does not make explicit the authorial position, if you want. And what is even much less obvious is whether the satire and the critique of a cultural construct implies actually, or constructs, or contributes actively to the construction of a possible counterculture. To go back to satire, and this is the point I'm going to conclude with, the importance of the satiric impulse in experimental fiction, and now I'm going back to the more modern or postmodern because of the texts are more numerous, right? It's not that they are more pertinent, but we have more illustrations of what I'm referring to. Often the satiric impulse of this kind of experimental fiction is blamed for being either invisible or ineffective. Ineffective, of course, from a Marxist or neo-Marxist perspective. That, you know, these satirists, novelist satirists, who imply the satiric message through parody most of the time, do not or fail to suggest an alternative to what they are criticizing. But again, some of the recent rereadings, and I'm referring here to a book by Robin Mukherjee, published 2013, in which he you know, deals with writers like William Burroughs, for instance. He you know, uses the expression of transgressive satirical fiction, or transgressive fiction, right, in which he rereads the satiric impulse of these narratives from the angle that allows him, or allows one, to see or to detect a possible vision, at least, or a possible premise of a counterculture, so that it is not simply pointless satire or pointless criticism of culture with no vision of an alternative. Okay, I'm going to conclude, you know, in a very weird manner, and I apologize for that, by going back to one of the classical texts that I really not only admire, but I see in Mark Twain's The Diary of Adam and Eve, a very good illustration of most of the points I've been referring to. And they are not the only two, so the first part entitled Extracts from Adam's Diary, but when he reaches Eve, so part 2, Eve's Diary, translated from the original, Twain, who is not really a postmodern, but more actually daring than many of the postmodernists, especially in targeting that allegorical, that when even a text, a construct, a literary expressive construct, does not explicitly target or critique, cultural norm, right? It can do so, but we have to reach its allegorical strata or layer. So he revisits the Genesis, the biblical narrative of the Genesis and the biblical narrative of the fall, but you notice through the missing voices of Adam and Eve, so we are immediately reminded that how come, the divine narrative does not allow us to see what Adam and Eve thought, right, of the creation, of the fall. So not only he assigns a point of view to the two protagonists of the biblical narrative, but he associates them with self-writing, which is, I think, more daring, more important. And as far as I know, Twain's critics did not pay much attention to this form of choice of the diary. So the diary means that when Adam and Eve, Adam and Eve are doing through self-narration, is not simply completing the archetypal pre-existing biblical narrative of the Genesis and that of the fall, but because they express themselves in writing, so they are in a way offering an alternative to the scripture. But of course, Twain also, knows that this is an ironic alternative, that his book, The Diary of Adam and Eve, is not really likely to supplant, right, or to stand as a real alternative. But the writing has or implies that provocative tone, right, of is it possible really to find another text, not simply another point of view, but another text that we would find more fun, right, more pleasant than the scripture. Okay, I think I have to stop here. Thank you very much.